Hello again. One more video for you this week. This time I'm going to talk about Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. It's a pretty remarkable letter. It's a little bit long, I know, but I do think there's a lot of really powerful stuff from King, and also a lot of stuff that can help us think about our poems, and a lot of stuff that I think we can contrast with Message from the Grassroots by Malcolm X that I've given you for homework this time. So keep all that stuff in mind as you think about this letter and as we talk about it here. Okay, so first of all, I think I want to talk about the writing style. So this is obviously a letter, right? This wasn't like an essay or something. So it starts off, my dear fellow clergymen. So we know from the beginning that King is writing to other people involved with the church, other people kind of in positions of power, right? And he's doing this because he's responding. It's because these clergymen have called his nonviolent protests in Birmingham unwise and untimely, right? And they are basically telling him, like the background singers in Mississippi Goddamn, they're telling Martin Luther King to go slow, right? You have to go slow. You're moving too fast. This stuff takes time. You just gotta wait for it. And of course, this letter appeared in a book King published called "Why We Can't Wait." So again, even though we view King as more of a moderate in terms of the civil rights movement, most people still viewed him as being too extreme. He even talks in here about these clergymen calling him an extremist, right? And how at first he was disappointed by that, but then he kind of accepts it. He says, maybe I should be an extremist, And then he says, well, wasn't Jesus an extremist? And this kind of stuff. So even though when we talk about the civil rights movement, we tend to think of King as less radical than Malcolm X and the black nationalists and stuff, in terms of the politics of the time period, the general politics of the country, he was viewed as radical. I think he was viewed as being extreme for doing nonviolent stuff. So something to keep in mind. Okay, but yeah, I wanted to also say about the writing style. He uses a lot of references, and maybe this is because he's writing to clergy people or whatever, but there's a lot of references to the Bible. Like on the first page, he's talking about why he's in Birmingham, and he says, just as the prophets of the 8th century left their villages and, carried their message beyond their borders, just as Paul, the Apostle Paul, left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world. So he's always making these Bible references, comparing himself, to Jesus or Paul. And the other repeated reference I see, and this comes up first on page 403, says, just as Socrates felt it was necessary to create attention, and he goes on. So he's also doing these ancient, Socrates kind of classical references. So yeah, just something to think about in terms of writing style, right? Because these are all choices about how do we convince people. And one way to do that is to kind of appeal to the authority of an outside source or something like that, or like a reference here. Yeah. So his audience is, it's not everyday people, it's not the people who are protesting, it's the clergy. He also uses these very logical kind of statements and definition kind of stuff where he says a law is unjust if it does this, but then if that means this, then how could you do this? So it's very precise and logical, and there's also a lot of references, I think, are some things we could say about his kind of writing style here. And he always uses a lot of metaphors too, right? That's kind of, if you think of I Have a Dream or just the way he talks, it's always, the great storm of injustice will pass and we will be at the hilltop of equality, He always speaks super metaphorically like that too. So that's something else. And so you can think about how those kinds of arguing styles, who they're going to reach and who they're not, right? So that's some stuff. Another thing I wanted to look at here, he says on page 402, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. So I take this to be him kind of coming out and saying, here's what I think we need to do. Here are the 4 steps that I think people need to go through to move towards equality, or at least the people who are protesting. This is the program that he wants them to follow. He says the 4 steps are, number 1, the collection of facts. Number 2, negotiation. Number 3, self-purification. And number 4, direct action. So when he says collection of the facts, he says to determine whether injustice exists. I guess that's yeah, making sure that there actually is unfair treatment or inequality going on. And then after that, he says negotiation. So, in a situation like Birmingham, where he sees how segregated it is and that there's not any jobs for black people and stuff, um, once they realize all those facts, right, then they try to negotiate. They go to the city council or the mayor or whatever, and they say, well, here are our problems, and here's what we want you to do, and let's make a deal. And then if that doesn't work, which in this case that didn't work, the next thing he does is he says self purification, which I think, as far as I can tell, are these kind of like non-violence workshops where it says, we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? So I guess basically they prepare themselves to be non-violent, to accept whatever violence is meted out against them without really fighting back, in his kind of turn the other cheek sort of way of doing this. So that's the self purification. Then he says direct action, and that would be the marches, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the boycotts, all of that kind of stuff. Um, so that's kind of the four-step process that he thinks you need to go through. So he says on page 403, because now I want to look at the goal. So that's like the process, right? He's going through those four steps, and then you get to direct action, and you do your march, and then what's supposed to happen? He says on page 403, you may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right to call in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. He goes on to say the purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. So even though negotiation is one of the steps that he goes through, it's also the goal. And this is key, guys, because I know how easy it is to say, well, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Christian nonviolent side and the black nationalists, they all just wanted black people to be treated better. And of course that's true. But when we're talking about differences in goals, we've got to be more specific than that. So Martin Luther King is saying here, the goal is still negotiation. So when they negotiate the first time, it doesn't work, right? They don't get the things they want. So basically, the idea is that by doing marches and protests and sit-ins and all these things, that you create enough tension that you can go back to the negotiation table with more leverage, basically. That the protests that he did were basically saying, like, if you don't give us what we want, if you don't desegregate restaurants or provide more employment opportunities for black people, we're going to keep on having these protests, and it's going to create a problem for the city or whatever, or we're going to boycott the buses, and that'll create a problem for the city. So he talks about how what he's trying to do is bring the tension that already exists in a segregated society and bring it to the forefront so everyone can see it, right? And yeah, I think this is a response too, because if you think about the mayor of the city or something, they're like, why are you messing with us? Why are you creating all these problems? And he's like, you're not negotiating with us. So that's an important point, though. The goal is still negotiation. So like in my other video, I was talking about how black nationalism is very interested in self-determination and that kind of stuff. I think this is fundamentally different, because if you're negotiating, you're still coming to the people in power and saying, here are the things we want, give them to us, and then the power can say yes or no, and they're trying to get the power to say yes, right, to give them what they want. But just seems fundamentally different to me than the idea of taking power for yourself, right, that I think is implied in the kind of self-determination that black nationalists were interested in. They didn't want to have to negotiate. They didn't want to compromise, mostly because they didn't trust the other side at all to do any of the things. And honestly, like the context here with Birmingham, he's trying to get like signs taken down, like segregation signs that say that only white people can use a certain place. And like this stuff didn't really end, even though the city said, okay, we'll stop doing it. It still worked in a lot of other ways. Like just because they officially put an end to it, that didn't totally stop it. And that's kind of a point that the black nationalists are trying to make, is like the kind of legal fixes can only go so far. And I think Martin Luther King knew that, but he still thought that this was the best path forward. So his stated goal here, we're reading from his words. He says the goal is negotiation. The goal is to get the people in power to negotiate with you and to have some leverage, being if you don't give us what we want, we'll continue the protests, right? So I think that's an important distinction between King and the black nationalists. Um, I just wanted to read from page 404 again about how kind of, even though King's goal was only negotiation, and that is, less radical than what the black nationalists were asking, King is still viewed as radical here. So I just want to read this paragraph on page 404, kind of dealing with people telling him that he needs to wait or he's going too fast or something. He says on 404, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was, quote, well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. So again, even that go slow from Mississippi Goddamn, that's even what Martin Luther King is hearing, So I just thought that was interesting, him kind of addressing that there. Another interesting thing that he mentions over here is kind of the psychological effects of segregation. Maybe we don't think about this as much because when there's people being murdered and things that seems more important than the psychological effects. But I still think it's important to consider, and he brings it up here. He talks about having to explain to his young daughter that Fun Town, I guess like an amusement park, is only for white children, and just like how soul crushing that is to have to say that to your young daughter, and it really is awful to think about. He goes on to say, I could see the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. So yeah, he talks about how it warps the personality. He goes on. Let me see. I think there's another quote on this. Yeah. He also says any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. So, yeah, just to speak to the kind of psychological effects of this sort of thing and how he says, it can distort people's personalities and souls, and just kind of how awful that is. And I didn't mention this, but I think one of the files that I posted, it had a list of these kind of Jim Crow laws, and they're absurd. Like there was Jim Crow laws about everything, about bars being segregated, or for movie theaters they had to have separate ticket booths. Cemeteries, you had to be buried in different places. They had laws against intermarriage. So I think it just shows just how these segregation laws tried to constantly follow black people around in every aspect of their life and just tell them you're not as good, you're not worthy of this. Just for so many just everyday things, they tried to make these segregation laws about it, and just terrible stuff, right? So I think King rightly points to the kind of psychological problems that can create. Okay, I also wanted to read this little part about, I think I asked you a question on the homework assignment about King's comments on white moderates. So I just want to read this part. He says, I must make two confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in its stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, into a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. Yeah, so I always think this is kind of an interesting and surprising thing to say, right? That the white moderate who says to him, well, I agree that black people are treated bad, it has to be better, but just not the way you're doing it wrong. And I think this is something whenever there's any sort of protest, whether it was King or whether it was like George Floyd protests or whether it was Colin Kaepernick or something. There's always someone who wants to say, well, that's not the correct way to protest. You're not doing it right. And I think what King is trying to say, well, according to these people, there's never a right time. There is no right way to do it. And I think that like part of King's mission, by doing the nonviolent approach and love your enemy and all that stuff, I maybe I'm speculating here, but I think at least at some point in his life, he probably thought that taking this route would make it more likely for the average white person who is not a hateful racist, who doesn't have strong opinions on this stuff, for that average white person, that it'd be easier for them to agree with King if he took this approach. And I think what he's saying, and this is 1963 too, so this is, I think King became even more disillusioned as his life went on. But so even what he's saying here is I was wrong. He's kind of admitting. Even he says like maybe I was too naive, maybe I expected too much from people. Because I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from obnoxious negative peace. Um, so yeah, I think like part of the idea of nonviolence and not fighting back and stuff is that by having people see that and the images of it getting played throughout the country, that public opinion would kind of move more towards desegregation, and he's kind of saying that's not what happened. And I think that it's a really big problem for him because it's like, well, if that doesn't work, then the only other option is violence. The only other option is kind of what the black nationalists are saying. So I think for him, the failure of the quote white moderate to um, get on board with what he's saying, and when he's trying to meet them halfway, and he's trying to be eminently reasonable and stuff, and preach love and everything. I think he's extremely disappointed that even though he's doing that, he hasn't won them over. It just hasn't happened. Like I was reading something else today talking about how some of these segregation figures had higher popularity ratings than Martin Luther King. So that's just where things were at the time. So that passage is always kind of shocking to me in a way, but I think also instructive for what the time period was and what these activists were up against. Another part that I want to look at here is his criticism of black nationalism. So this is important, right? Because I've been trying to draw the distinctions between the more nonviolent Martin Luther King side and the more black nationalists. So here's King's criticism of black nationalism. Okay, so he says here of black nationalism, the other force is one of bitterness and hatred. This is on page 408, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation. The largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, and that was the Nation of Islam, right? Nourished by the Negro's frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. This movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. Yeah, so that's kind of his criticism, is that he thinks that they're hateful. He thinks they've lost faith in America. That's an interesting one, right? Because I was trying to say that in the other video that the black nationalist idea of structural or institutional racism, where basically that the government, the American government, is not something that can bring about equality, that it's not really capable of doing that because of the way that it works, the institutions, how they were founded, who founded them, like the process that went through it, and also like I explained in the other video, the kind of constant war that the FBI was waging on any kind of anti-war or pro-civil rights activist during this time period. So I don't know. So he says that his criticisms are they lost faith in America, they've repudiated Christianity, and that one to me, I'm like, do I really care if they were Christian or Muslim or whatever? So I don't know how much of a criticism that, like how much we really need to think about that criticism. And then he says, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. And I tried to say in the other video how opinions on that kind of went from the most extreme to just a kind of skepticism if white people like could be trusted, or if they would be informants or whatever. So those are kind of his big criticisms. we'll see Malcolm X's criticisms of Martin Luther King when we look at his speech there. So yeah. Another quote I wanted to read. He says, "If repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history." That part kind of reminded me of Harlem. Like the ending of it. That or will it explode? And I think I talked in that video kind of about how you could look at it as like a cautionary tale or like a warning almost that like if we don't make things more equal, there's just going to be violence. Not necessarily like a threat, but that's what happens. That's like the necessary, like the cause and effect, right? So I think King is kind of giving voice to some of that. And yeah, there's just so much good stuff here. But the main things that I want us to take away are um, the like how he thought resistance should be done in terms of like the four steps that we mentioned, and that his goal at the end of the day is still to negotiate with power, not to seize power and take it for yourself, but to negotiate with those in power and at least have some leverage behind you in terms of the protests. All right. Really good essay though. Just I always feel like I'm incapable and unworthy of dealing with some of these great pieces of writing. I think this is one of them. Okay, that's all for now. See you soon.